Stokesay Castle has been a staple of formal dining and event space in Berks for a long time. But how does an old English castle end up nestled in the woods of Mount Penn, of all places? You have probably heard in passing that the place is haunted, and being a castle on a road called Spook Lane, you can't help but hope it is. Rumors of romance ending in suicide have been passed down through time as a reason for the possibility of a roaming spirit. However, the true story is a little more complicated and way more interesting. In October 1931, George Berks purchased 2 of the 3 pieces of land that Stokesay Castle would be built on. Having freshly graduated from Yale University the spring before, he came home to Reading to start his career. He was engaged to Anne Hall Nichols, daughter of Frederick Nichols and Minnie Taylor, a prominent wealthy family in Berks County. They would be wedded a little over a month later on November 27, 1931. But to get a better idea of who these 2 young lovebirds were, let's go back even further. They were both born in 1909 in Reading, Anne on February 25th and George less than 2 weeks later on March 7th. Anne's father died when she was only 2 years old. About a year before his death, when Anne was an infant, they purchased a new family home at 1531 Mineral Spring Road. She and her 3 older siblings would be raised there by her mother, who hired a governess to help look after and privately educate them after Frederick's passing. Eventually, she was sent to Oldfield School, an all-girls private school in Baltimore County, Maryland, from which she graduated in 1927. George was born to Isaac Heister and Mary Kimmel Bear, the culmination of 2 very prominent and well-known families in Berks. After the death of his maternal grandmother in 1916, the Bear estate, known as the Hawthorne, at 1501 Mineral Spring Road, was inherited by the 5 Bear daughters. His mother bought out her sisters for the family home and moved Isaac and their 3 children into the stone mansion. George and Anne were only 7 years old when their families became neighbors. George would also lose his father at a young age, in 1921, when he was only 12. They already had a lot in common. Both of their fathers were attorneys and died young. They were the same exact age and both from privileged families and sent to private schools. Did they play together and roam the grounds of the Hawthorne in their youth? After the death of George's father, his mother took him and his siblings on a trip to England in August of 1922. They ported in Southampton, which is only a 3.5-hour drive from the original Stokesay Castle, a 13th century manor house in Shropshire, England. It is this trip in which he visited and fell in love with the castle that he would eventually attempt to replicate as a gift for his future wife. At the time he saw that castle, they were both 13, and she was just the girl next door. George returned and began his secondary studies at the prestigious Hill School in Pottstown. He would graduate in 1927 and he continued his studies at Yale. It was at some point during college that him and Anne were engaged. There were various lavish events in the weeks leading up to their nuptials. Their ceremony took place on November 27, 1931 at Christ Episcopal Church at 5th and Court Streets in Reading. George enlisted the help of his cousin, architect Frederick A. Muhlenberg, to design him a replica castle to the one he had seen nearly a decade earlier in England as a boy. Stokesay would be completed in 1932. George and Anne welcomed their first and only child together, a daughter they named Robin, in 1933. The legend states that Anne hated the castle and resented George for building it without any input from her. Whether there's truth to this is undocumented, but their relationship did deteriorate rather quickly, and Anne initiated their divorce proceedings. Their marriage ended in October of 1936, only 5 years after it began, but 2 decades after becoming neighbors as children. Was it doomed from the start? Were they actually in love, or were they pressured by their families into a marriage that was more about status than actual compatibility? Newspaper clippings from the June 27, 1936 Reading Times, just 4 months before their divorce, show both George and Anne in a friend's wedding party with a man named Ferdinand K. Goetz. Ferdinand was of another prominent local family and lived with his uncle and aunt George and Emma Horst of the well-known Nolde and Horst hosiery mills. After divorcing George, Anne went on to marry Ferdinand Goetz in the spring of 1939. With him, she had a son, Peter, in 1941. Their family home on Filmay Terrace was not even 3,000 feet down the hill from Stokesay and Mount Penn. This leads us to wonder, did she meet him while she and George were in that wedding party? Did she leave George for Ferdinand? And perhaps it's all coincidence. It took over 2 years for her to marry Ferdinand. Maybe there was nothing at all between them at the time of her and George's divorce. We can only speculate with these few facts that I've managed to pull together. It isn't far-fetched to believe they might have all known each other for some time, since they all ran in the same social circles. Realistically, knowing the snail's pace at which legal proceedings take when it comes to divorce, the process was likely already in motion by the time they were all involved in that wedding party. Tragically, in 1949, Anne ended her own life. She shot herself in her Filmay Terrace home at 1:45 in the morning on February 7th, just a few weeks shy of her 40th birthday. I don't pretend to know what happens to the soul when it departs the body, but it's difficult to believe that she would go back to the castle she had only spent 5 years of her life in, which had ended 13 years prior. Is the castle itself truly haunted? I can't find any proof that anyone actually died there. George spent almost a quarter century as the main resident of the house, most of which he spent alone. Perhaps burned by the relationship with Anne, he remained single until marrying again after her death in 1951 to Maine native Barbara Ross. He brought her back and they lived in Stokesay for another 5 years together. George sold Stokesay in 1956 to Stokesay Inc., the company that would begin operations as a restaurant. He purchased a lot on Grandview Boulevard in Wyomissing Hills, which was being developed at that time. He built a rather modest rancher in comparison to his previous castle. He would also die in that dwelling 6 years later in 1962 at the age of 53 from cancer of the larynx. Could it have been his spirit that returned to the castle to wander the halls? Is it possible for our spirits to imprint on a certain place so important to us in life that the actual place of our death has no bearing on where it ends up? Your guess is as good as mine. Stokesay has undergone major changes since the Heasters left in 1956. A banquet hall was constructed in the 1960s, which has hosted numerous Berks County wedding receptions since. In 2007, the original owners were forced to close due to bankruptcy. It was purchased in 2009 by Jack Gulati, and operations were resumed after he completed some necessary renovations and upgrades. In 2011, the original architect, Fred Muhlenberg's firm, Muhlenberg Green Architects, was hired to design another addition to the building, the Knights Pub. The addition was constructed 80 years after Fred's original conception of Stokesay became reality. Yet, it's safe to say that the memory of these well-to-do Berks Countyans and their seemingly dramatic and luxurious lives live on not only in legend, but now truth.